She had planned for a lion. She had not planned for a lion who wanted to be caught, who had been circling her trap for a year, patient and burning, waiting for her to spring it. The cold stone of the Chandran terrace bit through the emerald silk of Maeve O'Connor's gown, and Arthur Vance, Duke of Stirling, had her pinned there with nothing but his body and the absolute, devastating certainty of a man who had already won. Forgive the interruption, but a quick word between friends. If you're finding this scandal as delicious as I am, do leave a like and join our inner circle by subscribing. It helps me unearth even more tales of longing and legacy for you. Before we proceed, do tell me in the comments, where are you tuning in from? I cherish every letter from my readers. Now, on to the prologue, as the secrets are just getting started. In all of London, no two people existed in greater opposition than the Duke of Stirling and the girl from County Clare. He was the Tun's immovable architecture, its rules, its silence, its marble severity. She was its most inconvenient storm, Irish-accented, estate-poor, and tonight, with the clock running out on everything her father had ever built, reckless enough to try to ruin herself on purpose. She had until midnight. One scandal, one powerful man shackled to her name by the unforgiving machinery of English propriety, one Irish estate, Caislean Mara, Castle of the Sea, saved from the cousin who meant to sell the stones to the sea. The plan was simple. The target was not. The Chandran ballroom on St. Patrick's Day was a fever dream rendered in green and gold. Lady Chandran, who possessed both impeccable taste and a magnificent indifference to restraint, had transformed her townhouse into something that defied the usual grey sobriety of London spring. Every sconce blazed, every surface had been draped in cascading swags of ivy and velvet the colour of new grass, and the guests, who had come in their masks and their best good humour, glittered beneath it all like so many coins tossed into deep water. Champagne moved through the crowd in rivers of pale gold. Somewhere beneath the string quartet's lilting reel, someone laughed too loudly and was loved for it. Maeve O'Connor stood at the edge of all this splendor and felt, for precisely one breath, like she was back in Clare. Is she looking at the sea from the cliffs of home? Then the breath ended. She straightened her spine. She was wearing her mother's gown, the one that had lived for 20 years in a cedarwood chest, too fine to sell, too beloved to alter, and tonight taken out and pressed and fitted to Maeve's narrower shoulders with trembling hands and a prayer. The emerald silk was old enough to have weight in the fabric, that particular richness that modern cloth never quite achieved, and against Maeve's dark hair and the flush the cold air had put into her cheeks, it made her look like a woman out of a painting, or a folk tale, the kind of woman who made bargains by moonlight. Her gold mask covered her eyes and the bridge of her nose, but it hid nothing about the set of her jaw. She had come here with a purpose, not to dance, not to be admired. She had come here to be ruined, carefully, strategically, and with the most formidable instrument the Tun possessed. Her gaze moved through the room with the deliberate patience of a chess player who could see 5 moves ahead but had only one piece left to spend. She found him almost immediately. There, at the far end of the ballroom, standing in the kind of stillness that certain men could carry like a weapon, Arthur Vance, Duke of Stirling. He wore no mask. In a room full of people playing at anonymity, his refusal to conceal himself was itself a kind of statement. I have no face I need to hide. He was dressed in severe, midnight black save for the small green token in his lapel, a single concession to the evening's occasion. And even that looked like surrender from everyone else's evening, and victory from his. He was speaking to no one. He was watching everything. He was, by every measurable account, the worst possible target. He was also the only one who would work. The Duke of Stirling's name in connection with hers would set every gossip column in London on fire. His engagement, if it came to that, would be unbreakable. His title was old enough and his consequence severe enough that even her vile cousin Declan would not dare challenge the union. The estate would be safe. She would be safe. You only have to get close enough, Maeve told herself. Just close enough to start the fire. Across the glittering, oblivious room, the Duke's dark eyes settled on her. She did not look away. Neither did he. "Oh," said the small, honest part of her that she rarely let speak. "Oh, this is going to be so much worse than I thought." She retreated to the shadow of a potted lemon tree near the east wall, pressed her fan against her sternum, and reviewed her plan with the grim discipline of a general who knows the battle begins at dawn. It was, she had to admit, a reasonably elegant plan for something built on desperation and a sleepless night. Step 1. The dropped fan. Simple. Old as time. She would pass near him, let the fan slip from her wrist, accidentally, and walk away without retrieving it. It would require him to follow. No gentleman of standing could leave a lady's property on the floor. The social obligation would compel him, and she would be out the terrace doors before he had crossed half the room, which would make him look even more deliberate in his pursuit. Step 2. The Rose Garden. Lady Chandrin's terrace connected to a famous winter rose garden, and almost entirely secluded, and at this hour thick with cold shadow. The gossips she needed, Lady Harriet Ashmore and her circle, who had constituted themselves London's most reliable engine of ruinous information, were currently stationed near the terrace doors, precisely because Lady Harriet believed that the most interesting things at any party happened where people thought no one was watching. She was not wrong about this. Maeve was counting on it. Step 3. The stumble. Once she had the Duke in the garden, she would feign a turned ankle, reach for him, and ensure that they were found in an attitude that even the most charitable interpretation could not dismiss as innocent. A woman in a man's arms in the dark, his hand at her waist, her fingers clutching the lapels of his coat. She pressed her fan harder against her ribs. The plan was sound. The plan was fine. The problem was the target. Every other man she had considered and dismissed tonight possessed the essential quality of being manageable. Lord Pembury was susceptible to flattery. Viscount Crail was susceptible to wine. Even old Lord Ashfield, whom she had briefly, miserably considered, was susceptible to nostalgia and the memory of Ireland. These men were doors with predictable locks. The Duke of Stirling had never, in living ton memory, been susceptible to anything. He was 34 years old, and had been governing himself and his considerable estate with the same terrifying competence since inheriting the title at 22. He was not cruel. Cruelty required a kind of engagement he seemed to find beneath him. But he was cold in the way that certain stone was cold, not hostile, say simply at a temperature that the warmth of other human bodies could not penetrate. Mammas stopped presenting their daughters to him after a while. The matchmakers had given up. He attended every ball, every rout, every event that his position required, and he left each one having spoken perhaps 30 words to other human beings, all of them polite, none of them meaningful. He was not a man who could be flirted into a corner. He was not a man who could be stumbled into an embrace. He was, Maeve thought with the clear-eyed despair of someone who has run out of options, the only man in London whose involvement in a scandal would be definitive enough to save her home. He's a man, she told herself, summoning every last fragment of courage she possessed. He has eyes. He has a reputation to protect. He'll behave exactly as any man would when a young woman stumbles in the dark. She straightened. She closed her fan. She moved away from the lemon tree, back toward the bright, breathing heart of the ballroom. She did not look at him again. Not yet. The crossing of the ballroom took 4 minutes and felt like 4 years. Maeve moved through it with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent 2 seasons being overlooked, and in this moment she was grateful for every minute of it. Grateful for the way her wallflowers training had taught her to navigate crowded spaces, like water finding a path between stones, unnoticed, unimpeded, using the current of other people's conversations and laughter as cover. She paused to accept a glass of champagne she did not drink, as she smiled at Lady Montrose's daughter and forgot the girl's name immediately. She commented on the flowers to a woman in a blue domino and moved on before the woman could return the conversation. And all the while, she tracked him in her peripheral vision. He hadn't moved. He stood at the far end of the room with the same contained, terrifying stillness, and as she drew closer, close enough now to see the clean, severe line of his jaw, the architecture of cheekbones that his tailor and his title and his manner all conspired to make insufferably distinguished, she felt the first true bloom of fear open in her chest. Not fear of failure, fear of him. She was close enough now that she could see the precise direction of his gaze, and his gaze, she realized with a jolt of cold clarity, was directed at her, not at the room. Not at the door, or the dancers, or the champagne service. At her. It had been at her for some time. He's noticed the approach, she thought. Doesn't matter. Proceed. She adjusted the fan on her wrist, loosened the ribbon just slightly. Enough. She passed to his left, not too close, maintaining the exact distance that society prescribed for two people who are not in conversation. Close enough for courtesy. Far enough for deniability. Her eyes were forward. Her chin was up. She was a woman moving through a ballroom. That was all. That was all she was. Her hand opened. The fan fell. The ivory handle caught the light as it spun and landed with a soft click on the polished floor, a small pale thing in the middle of all that green and gold excess. Maeve did not stop. She did not turn. She moved on toward the terraced doors at the same unhurried pace, in navigating the last few yards of the crowd with the same quiet certainty, and she did not allow herself to look back. Not to see if he had seen, not to see if he had bent to retrieve it, not to see if those dark eyes were tracking her exit. She passed through the terrace doors into the cold, dark air beyond. She did not run. She allowed herself, perhaps, to walk a little faster than she normally would. The terrace struck her like a hand laid flat against her skin. London in March had no patience for silk gowns or desperate plans or the particular brand of barely contained panic that was currently occupying Maeve's chest. The cold came up off the stone floor, through the thin soles of her slippers, and the ivy that curtained the terrace from the rest of the garden stirred in the dark, like something slow and breathing. The light from the ballroom fell in warm oblongs through the glass doors behind her, reaching only so far before the dark swallowed it. And Maeve moved to the stone balustrade at the terrace's far end, where the shadow was deepest and the ivy was thickest, and pressed her gloved hands against the cold stone and breathed. In, out. The rose garden beyond the terrace railing was a tangle of winter branches and frost-grey gravel, beautiful in the way of things that had survived cold seasons. The iron gate to it stood open. She had checked that earlier in the evening because she was a woman who checked her exits, and the sight of it standing ajar in the darkness steadied her slightly. She counted her breaths. She counted the seconds. The string quartet was faint now, filtered through glass and distance, while just the ghost of its reel drifting out into the night. Somewhere inside, Lady Harriet and her circle were still stationed at the inner terrace doors, their masks catching the candlelight, their ears tuned to the frequency of other people's catastrophes. Just the stumble now, Maeve thought. Just the stumble and the arm, and let them see. That's all. That's all that's left. And then she heard footsteps. Not the light, social steps of someone who had wandered out for air. Not the tentative steps of someone uncertain of their errand. These were heavy, measured, deliberate. The steps of a man who knew exactly where he was going and had decided, with the same cold finality he brought to everything, that he was going to arrive. They crossed the terrace toward her without hesitation. 1, 2, 3. They did not slow. Her hand tightened on the cold stone balustrade. She turned slightly toward the garden, positioning herself for the feigned stumble. She would step toward the gate, catch her heel on the threshold, reach back. He was much, much closer than she had calculated. She heard the air move before she heard anything else. She turned, and he was there, so close that the warmth of him was the first thing she registered against the cold, a startling wall of body heat that her skin greeted with a traitor's gratitude before her mind could object. The Duke of Stirling in the dark was not the same creature she had catalogued from across the ballroom. There, he had been manageable, distant, framed by candlelight in the geometry of a room, reduced by space to something she could study at a remove. Here, he was simply enormous in every sense that mattered. Physically, atmospherically, in the way that certain people occupy the air around them and make all other air seem insufficient. She had not even finished turning when his hand came to the stone wall beside her head. Flat, controlled, not a threat, and yet. 2 strides. He had crossed the remaining distance in 2 strides, and now he was between her and the terrace doors, between her and the garden gate, between her and every part of her plan that depended on having room to maneuver, and the stone wall of the terrace was solid and cold against her shoulder blades, and the ivy rustled and settled and went quiet. He did not touch her. His hand was 6 inches from her head, his body close enough that she could see the small green token in his lapel with painful clarity. And he looked down at her from his insufferable height with an expression that she could not read in the dark except to say that it was the opposite of cold. It was the opposite of cold, and it terrified her more than cold would have. She opened her mouth. She had a line prepared. Something breathless, something helpless, the beginning of the scene she had scripted for herself and for the watching eyes she hoped were pressed against the glass doors behind him. "I was just," she began. "Don't," he said. The word was quiet. It should not have stopped her the way it did. But there was something in the register of it. Low, held tight, as though he had been restraining it for some time and was only now permitting it the minimum of release, that made the prepared sentence dissolve on her tongue like sugar in rain. She had expected cold. She had expected the polished, dismissive authority that was his public register, the tone of a man correcting a minor social error before returning to more important concerns. This was not that. "I know what you were going to say," he continued, and his voice in the dark was entirely different from his voice in a ballroom, stripped of the performance of indifference, rougher at the edges, and concentrated in the way that certain things are concentrated by heat. He had not moved. His hand was still flat against the stone. He was still not touching her. "And I know what you were going to do before I interrupted you. The stumble. The reach." He paused. A beat. "You chose your ankle, I imagine." Maeve's entire body went still in the way that prey goes still. Not from acquiescence, but from the sudden, visceral recognition that the calculation she had made was wrong in a way she had not anticipated and could not immediately name. "You're very certain of a great deal," she said, and was proud of her voice, which came out steady despite everything. "I'm certain of you," he said, and the way he said it. Not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but with a kind of quiet finality, as though it were a fact he had lived with for long enough that defending it would be absurd, made her breath catch in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "I've been watching you for a year, Miss O'Connor. I know the difference between a woman who stumbles and a woman who intends to." The ivy moved in the wind. The faint music drifted. Somewhere behind the glass doors, The party continued in its golden, ignorant warmth, and here, 6 inches from the Duke of Stirling, Maeve became aware of a terrible new possibility. That she was not, as she had believed, the only person on this terrace who had come here on purpose. "Then you should step back," she said, "and let me—" "No," he said. And then, with a kind of deliberateness that was its own form of violence, he closed the last of the distance between them. She had planned for a kiss. She had scripted it, brief, compromising, sufficient. A man's mouth at a woman's temple, a hand at her waist, discoverable in the amber light from the doors. She had mapped it out with the cold pragmatism of someone who has run out of cleaner options. She had planned for the idea of a kiss. She had not planned for him. His mouth found hers in the dark with the certainty of a man who has been navigating toward a specific point for a very long time and has finally been given permission to arrive. There was nothing tentative in it. There was nothing polite or measured or social. All the qualities that defined the public Duke of Stirling were absent here, replaced by something else entirely. Something that had apparently been accumulating beneath all that marble precision for long enough that it now had a specific gravity, specific heat. He kissed her like a man setting down a weight he'd been carrying too long. Maeve's hands came up between them, to push him back, to complete the performance, to do something useful and intentional. And then his other hand came to the stone wall on her other side, and she was framed by him, surrounded by warmth in the cold dark, and the emerald silk of her mother's dress whispered against the stone and his waistcoat, and her hands abandoned their purpose and found his lapels instead. She had not scripted this part. She had not scripted the way his hand finally moved from the wall to her jaw, careful, almost reverent, as though she were something that could be broken and he was choosing not to break her. She had not scripted the particular quality of his breath against her skin, the slight unsteadiness of it, the evidence of a man who had constructed his own control like architecture and was feeling it list. She had not scripted the way the prepared emptiness of her performance dissolved, layer by layer, until what remained was not a trapped Irish wallflower, executing a plan, but a girl who had spent 2 seasons feeling invisible, being kissed in the cold dark by a man who kissed her as though she were the only thing in London worth seeing. Her fingers tangled in his hair. It was the most honest thing she had done all evening. She hated it. She never wanted to stop. The terrace doors opened. The sound was shattering in the quiet. A gust of warm light and music, and the bright, razored voices of the town's most industrious observers spilling out across the cold stone. Maeve felt the Duke go still against her, that particular stillness she recognized now as his response to external events. Not surprise, not panic, simply the absorption of new information. She pulled back. Lady Harriet Ashmore stood in the doorway. She was flanked by 3 women of equal consequence and greater cruelty, their masks pushed up above their hairlines, their eyes wide and luminous with the expression of people who have just received an extraordinary gift. Behind them, jostling for position with the shameless urgency of people who have scented a season's worth of gossip, were perhaps 6 more of the town's most dedicated correspondents. When Maeve's heart hammered, she made herself breathe. She made herself look in that fraction of a second at the tableau from the outside, a pristine Duke and an Irish nobody caught against the ivy-curtained terrace wall, her hands at his shoulders, his body still angled toward her, both of them undeniably, irrevocably, exquisitely compromised. There was no alternative reading. There was no version of this that Lady Harriet Ashmore and her companions would not carry to every drawing-room in London before the morning. "It worked," said the cold, practical part of her. "You did it. Caerleon Mar is safe." "Your Grace," Lady Harriet breathed, with the particular reverence of someone witnessing the collapse of something they believed indestructible. The door was cold out here." said one of the women behind her, or for lack of anything more coherent. The Duke did not step away from Maeve. He did not straighten his coat or wipe her from his expression. He stood where he was, his hands still loosely at her jaw, looking at the audience that had gathered at the door with the same calm indifference with which, she imagined, he looked at every other inconvenient thing in his life. A small, horrible triumph was moving through Maeve's chest. She had done it. She had actually done it. And then he leaned down and put his lips very close to her ear. His voice was barely a breath. It was the kind of voice that did not need to be louder because it was already inside the room of her. Quiet, specific, aimed precisely at the part of her that had believed until this moment that she was the author of the evening. "Your plan was elegant," he said. She went very still. Her eyes were still on Lady Harriet's stricken face. Her hands were still at his shoulders. The emerald silk was cold against her skin, and his breath was warm against her ear. "I intercepted your letters to the solicitor in February," he continued, unhurried, as though they were discussing the weather and not the architecture of her entire deception. "All 3 of them. I know about the debt. I know about your cousin's claim. I know what you needed tonight and why you chose me." The briefest pause. She heard Lady Harriet whisper something to the woman beside her. She heard her own heart beat, very loud in the cold dark. "I also purchased Caislian Mara this morning. The deed was transferred to your name at 10:30. Your cousin has no claim. He hasn't had one since breakfast." The world performed a slow, noiseless revolution. Maeve said nothing. She was not capable of saying anything. The triumph she had been holding was undergoing a very rapid transformation into something she did not yet have a name for, something with too many edges, something that felt uncomfortably like the moment you realize you have been looking at a map upside down for the entirety of a very long journey. "You bought my estate," she said. Her lips barely moved. "Yes. Before tonight." "Yes. Then why?" She stopped. She recalibrated. "You didn't have to be here. You didn't have to follow me out here. You didn't have to—" She could not finish the sentence. The ivory fan had been a signal, and he had known it was a signal, and he had walked through the ballroom, and across the terrace, and into the dark, in full possession of every fact she had believed she was concealing. "No," he agreed. "I didn't have to." The hand at her jaw moved, just slightly, tilting her face the smallest degree toward his. "I've been waiting a year for you to give me a reason, Miss O'Connor. I decided to stop waiting and let you believe you'd found one." Another pause, and the warmth of it made something in her chest do something structurally inadvisable. "You were never trapping me. I was tired of the door being locked." The audience at the terrace door had gone very, very quiet. The string quartet played on, oblivious, somewhere in the warm interior of the world she had left behind. Arthur Vance, Duke of Stirling, straightened. He turned toward the gathered observers of the ton, with Maeve O'Connor still at his side, his hand having moved smoothly, proprietorially, in a way that brooked precisely no interpretation other than the one he intended, to the small of her back. His expression, visible now in the spill of golden light from the open doors, was not embarrassed. It was not defensive. It was the expression of a man who has arranged exactly what he intended to arrange and is prepared, with considerable calm, to announce it. "Lady Harriet," the Duke said. His voice in public was restored to its usual register, commanding, unhurried, with a clarity that the ballroom beyond could have heard quite clearly, and would momentarily. The crowd at the terrace door had swelled. Several more faces had appeared at the glass behind them, drawn by the specific animal magnetism of a gathering that smells like consequence. "Your Grace," Lady Harriet managed. "You'll have gathered," he said, and with the measured patience of a man reading a prepared statement to a governing body, "that Miss O'Connor and I have an understanding." He paused, and the pause was architectural, built to carry weight, to accommodate the collective intake of breath from the assembled witnesses. The announcement would have come in the proper order, through the proper channels in the morning. The evening has moved at its own pace. His eyes moved briefly and pointedly over the gathered observers in a way that made several of them suddenly fascinated by their shoes. "We're engaged." 2 words. They fell into the cold air of the terrace and sank through it, all the way to the stone floor, and the silence they produced was the specific silence of something irrevocable. Lady Harriet said, "They engaged," in the tone of a woman watching a cathedral be built in real time. "To be married," he confirmed, as though this were the redundancy it technically was, and not the most devastating clarification Maeve had ever heard delivered. "You will naturally want to verify the particulars. I suggest you do so in the morning, with Miss O'Connor's solicitor, and with mine." He looked at the cluster of observers without warmth or apology. "In the meantime, I imagine the ballroom has champagne that isn't being consumed." This was, unmistakably, a dismissal. Lady Harriet and her companions retreated with the stunned obedience of people who have been addressed by something more powerful than themselves. The crowd at the glass melted back into the ballroom. The terrace doors swung closed, not completely, but enough. The Duke's hand remained at the small of Maeve's back. Maeve was looking at the middle distance, at the cold garden beyond the railing, and the frost on the gravel, and the world that had just rearranged itself around her without asking permission. Her mother's emerald silk moved in the wind. She was aware, peripherally, of the warmth of his hand through the fabric, and of the fact that it had not moved, and of the further fact that she did not want it to. "You could have just told me," she said. Her voice was very level. She was proud of her voice, this morning. "When you could have sent the deed. You didn't need—" "No," he said. "You didn't need to." "No," he said again, and there was something in the repetition that was almost gentle. "But you would have refused. You would have found it insulting, or presumptuous, or charitable. And so you would have built a wall out of whatever objection came first to hand, and we would have had this conversation at a 3-year remove. And I have," he said quietly, "been patient for quite long enough." Maeve turned to look at him at last. In the thin light that remained, lamplight from the garden, the dim leak of the ballroom, the early cold stars above the London roofline, Arthur Vance, Duke of Stirling, looked like neither the public man she had studied from a distance for 2 seasons nor the terrifying warmth she had encountered in the dark. He looked improbably and a little undonely, like a man who had been holding his breath and had just, provisionally, been permitted to exhale. "You bought my home," she said. "Yes." "You intercepted my letters." "Yes." "You've been watching me for a year." "Yes." She held his gaze, and he held hers. Neither of them looked away. "That is," she said carefully, "a great deal of effort for a woman you've never spoken to." "I've been correcting that oversight this evening," he said, and something shifted in his expression, the very edge of something that, on a less severe face, might have been called rueful. "And I intend to continue correcting it, at length, for the foreseeable future." The hand at her back pressed the smallest degree. "Beginning tomorrow, with a proper call, through the proper channels, which you can refuse if you choose. The estate is yours regardless. I want to be clear about that." "And tonight?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment. "Tonight," he said, "you walked out onto a dark terrace to trap a man who had already decided to let himself be caught." A pause. "I thought that warranted a proper kiss before the lawyers arrived." Maeve O'Connor, who had come to this ball with a desperate plan and a borrowed gown and exactly nothing left to lose, looked up at the Duke of Stirling and felt the last of the evening's careful architecture, all the scaffolding of her scheming, come quietly apart. She laughed. She hadn't meant to. It was small and real, and had nothing performed in it at all. He watched her laugh with the expression of a man receiving something he had been afraid to want. She understood it fully, for the first time in the carriage. Her aunt had been collected from the card room with a speed that suggested prior arrangement, which Maeve was beginning to believe was exactly what it was. The Duke's carriage, dark lacquer, leather sterling crest and restrained gold on the door, had appeared at the Chandran's steps with the readiness of a vehicle that had been waiting. He had handed her in with the ceremony, due a woman he intended to marry, and said nothing on the short ride, which was a kind of speech in itself. In the quiet of the carriage, watching the lamplit streets of London slide past the window, Maeve turned the evening over in her mind, with the careful attention of someone examining the object they have accidentally brought home from a foreign country. Not sure yet if it is art or an artifact, not sure yet what it is worth. She had gone to the Chandran ball to lay a trap. She had chosen her quarry, mapped her approach, executed her steps with a precision she had been proud of. She had dropped the fan. She had walked into the dark. She had felt, and in the moment the terrace doors swung open, and Lady Harriet's face went slack with shock, the specific cold satisfaction of a plan that has worked. None of it had been what she thought. The fan had landed at the feet of a man who had been expecting it. The dark terrace had been entered by a woman who believed herself the hunter, and a man who had been waiting, patient as architecture, for her to come to him. The trap she had built with her letters, and her borrowed gown, and her mother's green silk had been examined and understood, and with a thoroughness that was beginning to feel less like violation and more like something else, something she did not yet have language for, appreciated before she had even arrived. "I've been watching you for a year," he had said in the dark, against her ear. "I was tired of the door being locked, so the carriage stopped. The footman opened the door and the cold night air returned, and the Duke was there on the pavement, his hand extended, and she took it and stepped down into the lamplight and looked at his face. The look he gave her was not the look of a man who has won a game. It was the look of a man who has finally, after a long time alone in a cold house, arrived somewhere he intended to stay. "You didn't trap a lion," said the small, honest voice in her chest. The voice she never silenced. The voice that was, in its way, the truest part of her. "You walked into a cage. And the cage was built for you, and the door is still open, and he is standing here, waiting to see what you will do." "Tomorrow," the Duke said, his voice low and even in the night air. "10:30. I'll call properly." His hand was still holding hers, but he had not let go, and she understood with the clarity of someone who has just seen the whole board that he would not be letting go any time soon. "You can refuse if you choose." "You said that already," she said. "I'm going to keep saying it," he said, "until I'm certain you believe it." She looked at him for a long moment. This precise, terrifying, infuriatingly thorough man who had brought her home and waited a year and kissed her in the cold dark and announced her to London's gossips with the calm confidence of someone making a statement of fact. And she felt the last of the evening's fear and fury and desperate cleverness settle, like sediment after a storm, into something clear. She had come to the ball to take control of her life. She had not expected the form that control would take. And she had not expected that at the far end of a desperate plan there would be, against all logic and probability, this. 10:30, she said. Something moved through his expression. Brief, luminous, quickly contained. "Yes. Bring the deed," she said. "I want to read it myself." "I expected nothing less," he said. He released her hand. She went inside. The carriage door closed, and in the dark, in the lamplight, in the echoing quiet of a London night, Arthur Vance, Duke of Stirling, stood on the pavement outside her door for a long, unhurried moment before he returned to the carriage. because he was not, it turned out, a man of ice at all. He was a man who had simply been waiting, with the patience of stone and the warmth of something much older than stone, for the right woman to walk into the dark and find him there. That he had always known she would. He had only needed her to know it too.